Hey there, welcome to our AP Legal Zone podcast, brought to you by AP Lawyers. We are your top fix for all weekly law updates, including family, immigration, wills, and estates law. Just a friendly reminder, we are not your lawyers, and everything contained in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not to be construed as legal advice. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay connected with any updates and get notified about our new episodes. Hi everyone, my name is Sherine Abdi and I'm joined with Angela Princewill, and today's topic is going to be about parenting, specifically decision-making responsibilities and parenting time. So Angela, what are decision-making responsibilities?
So yeah, in a family law context, when we're thinking about decision-making responsibilities, we're really thinking about major decisions, right? So this is different from the sort of day-to-day decisions regarding the care of children. We're thinking about major decisions, and we think in terms of broad headings like, religion, health, education, extracurricular activities. Now, we will talk a little bit more later about sort of day-to-day decisions, but when it comes to major decisions, Sherine, what kind of options, I'm going to throw this back at you, what kind of options are available to parties separating for, I guess, structuring something that works for their family?
Yeah, so there's actually several different options, and I think that's also a common misconception is that it could be just one party having, sole decision-making responsibilities, or the other option is joint. There's actually another option as well, and that's split. So sole is really where, if after consulting with the other party that you can't make that final decision, the other party will then be able to make that final decision. Split is where you can actually split the decisions in those four broad categories that Angela just spoke about. So maybe one party can have education and healthcare, and the other party can have religion and extracurricular activities. Often, I'm sure that leads to conflict, but we'll talk about that shortly after.
Actually, I'm going to talk about that now, Sherine, because split seems like a simple way for you to just solve the problem, right? If we can't decide on decisions, let's just split it and be done with it.
Yeah, or if they're like a very contentious relationship where it doesn't make sense for you guys to come to the decision together.
If so, be careful. I guess is the caution that is the watchword here, because a lot of these decisions are not that clean cut, right? At what point does a decision regarding education it could also be a religious decision? So I'll give an example. If you're deciding on what school a child should attend, and one parent wants Catholic school and the other one wants public school. Well, is Catholic school a decision about education, or is it one about religion, right? Because once you bring in that religious school component to it, then you're entering the realm of decision, but it's school, so it's education. Or even extracurricular and health, for example. One parent may have very strong views about the health consequences of certain, like, sporting activities, for example. So if there's a huge conflict and it's viewed as a healthcare decision, well, if another party has extracurricular decision making, like final responsibilities there, you could see how these things can create conflict. So while we've told you that there's options for you, and it's not just, when you end a relationship, it doesn't mean that one person just gets to make all the decisions. And it also doesn't mean that you guys must have a joint decision-making responsibilities. You can have split, but whatever option you choose, you have to be mindful.
Yeah, so there's definitely like the overlap consideration there. So if you want maybe a specific decision on a very specific area, be prepared to make that very specific provision in a court order or in an agreement, because has been given rise to several different issues in the past, and obviously going forward, especially with the COVID vaccine coming up and things like that.
Yeah.
So you also touched on the last one, which was the joint decision-making responsibility, so that both parties together have to make that final decision. So in making major decisions, so that's another component to how you can actually structure the decision-making responsibility.
And I think, I think I want to add here that joint decision-making is or equal decision making responsibilities is the default under the law where there's no order or something else, or agreement, right, made between the parties. So you both as parents have equal rights to make decisions for the child, subject to a court ordering otherwise, or you guys agreeing to do things differently. I know that something that always bothers people when they think in terms of decision making responsibilities is they think of it as a sort of a right. It's my right, it's my child. And so the act lists this as it's an obligation, it's a responsibility. So you have to kind of view it that way. And we're going to touch on how, you know, the best interest of the child being the primary consideration, but it's a responsibility. Actually, having said that, this kind of leads me to something I want to mention, because in our, I think it was actually episode 1, Sherine, we had talked about the changes to the Divorce Act. And in the past, you know, we talked about custody and access, and it created a lot of conflict. So now we're speaking in terms the act changed. And so if you don't really know what we're talking about, go back to episode 1 where we talk about Divorce Act changes, and Sherine and I kind of went over custody and access and the new terminology. But again, the courts have made it very clear that we should, when we think decision making for children, it's a responsibility, and you know, that's not just a right. And Sherine, I don't know if you want to touch on this, but I think a concern people generally had was if one person has decision making responsibility, whether for all major decisions or on just some, does that mean I don't know, I'm out of touch with what's happening to my child in that regard?
No, so absolutely not. So even if you have the sole decision making responsibility in an area or in just in general, it doesn't mean that there's no obligation for you to consult the other party. And depending on the terms of your court order and agreement, it may mean a meaningful consultation. So it's not just, okay, he said no, so I'm going to make a final decision and I'm going to just enroll him in school, you know, of my choosing. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, you do have to consult with the other party. You have the obligation to do so prior to making a decision. And then in addition to that, there's also the right that both parents have for information. So this is actually a common thing that I've come across with my clients as well, where, you know, maybe the other party made a decision or is not allowing them to have like the child's report cards or medical records. But under the law, you actually have a right to those records, those third-party records. So you can call the doctor's office and you can let them know, listen, I am, you know, X is parent and I need to get, you know, the most recent medical report or the lab report or anything that you need, or any meaningful advice and information that you need from their doctor, from their school provider, from their educators, or anyone that's working with your child.
And if you're the parent that has you know, sole decision making responsibility, I think part of with what comes with that is also an obligation to inform the other parent about decisions that you've made and things like that.
Yes, and share the information that you've received. So if you've received the report card, then it's under your obligation to usually share that same record with the other parent.
Yes.
And those progress reports or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So I think with decision-making responsibility comes day-to-day decisions. And I think this is the most misunderstood concept, because even though you have final decision-making responsibility in a particular area or in general, it doesn't mean that you get to make all those decisions. Those only apply to, as Angela said, major decisions.
Yes, I think there's a lot of day-to-day decisions that people kind of lose sight of. And I mean, I honestly pay a lot of I think it takes the day-to-day decisions, in my opinion, as actually
more important.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't want to say it just like that.
I think they're quite important.
I think so. I feel that as children grow, there's, you know, the day-to-day is what shapes them, right? And from day-to-day decisions, we mean things like what time do they go to bed, you know, their routines. What kind of food are you feeding them?
How long are they going to spend on their homework? What time do they spend?
Time spent on devices. That's a major one, you know?
You know, sometimes the other parent wants to regulate so much of the other parent's time, when in reality, that's actually not in their authority to do so.
Yes, so when you have parenting time, with that comes your right to make those day-to-day decisions. And I think, and that's something that I try to let clients know, and it's no one size fit all. if in trying to resolve conflict, sometimes you have to look at what are we trying to accomplish here. So if a parent is fixated on having decision making responsibility, depending on where the child is, the stage of in the child's life, sometimes it may not even be that significant, right? If the child's already going to this Catholic school and both parents already are in agreement that the child would attend this school until they go to high school next door, then education for the most part is really not an area of conflict, right? Now, clearly, if the child needs support that the child isn't getting, it doesn't matter if one parent has decision making responsibilities. If you have to go to court to make sure that your child gets the support they need, it doesn't matter whether they have soul or whatever. That's your obligation
and with
as a
things
parent.
with things like professionals working with your children, for doctors, I usually would add for, I guess, agreements or court orders, is that your decision has to be in line with what the professional recommends. So if they recommend that your child needs a tutor, I mean, it's not going to be a difficulty. Well, we imagine it's not going to be
so
difficult.
In some cases, as a general rule, I feel like when the children are younger and there's a lot of transition, so we're looking at from daycare to kindergarten then I find that major decisions come a lot more. There's the decision between registering the child for ballet versus, I don't know, karate could be a huge one. But when they're a little bit older, so they're 12 years old, they're already, or even in grade 6 or whatever, then a lot of times the decisions with, say, extracurriculars is driven by the child's interests, right? They're the healthcare decisions, as you said. Most people would defer to the professionals and things like that. So in those cases, when it doesn't look like, and again, we're just speculating, we could be wrong, but we're just speculating that in some of these cases, maybe fighting so much over decision making responsibilities might not be the best priority for you.
Yeah.
If you have all of the parenting time you want and the ability to shape the child's life on a day-to-day, you might actually accomplish your goals that way and forget about those few decisions.
Yeah, you might actually be surprised that major decisions don't come about as much, because even I actually had a file recently in mediation, and the mediator asked, well, they were actually very polarized on the issue of decision-making responsibility. Obviously, one party wanted to have sole decision, the other wanted joint. And in that case, the mediator asked, well, how in this past year or two that you've been separated, how many decisions have you had to have made? And funny enough, none. Absolutely none.
That's interesting.
So, and then it kind of helped them work their way around maybe a joint parenting decision-making responsibility, because I don't think you realize that it doesn't come out as often as you think it does.
The day-to-day is
where the bulk of the parenting would actually come into place.
Yeah.
Like, as you said, that's really where you can actually shape your child. And I think a lot of the problems we have is sometimes, while we like to keep both households in line with each other, especially if there's a young child and there's a potty training schedule, you want the other party to adhere to it, because all of your efforts in potty training the child go to waste if the other party's not doing their part. So things like that make sense, but when you're regulating to an extent the exact ability for that person to make those day-to-day decisions is actually not appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I remember once I had a matter and my client wanted to limit parenting time because of the dietary, I don't know, choices in the other home. And honestly, I understand. She wanted to, from her perspective, I could see where she was coming from. She's like, well, he never has time. He's buying them fast food. They're getting candy. They're doing this. And she's like, you know what? He currently has every other weekend and a few days during the week. So maybe we should limit that so that I make sure that every day I can ensure, because I'm a stay-at-home mom, that they have a healthy home-cooked meal every day. Can I appreciate that? Absolutely. Is it great for the kids? Of course. Did the courts share my appreciation? No, because you know what? They're like, that doesn't matter.
Especially
like
with such a smaller amount of parenting window.
And again, the child, we need to remember, like, and we're going to touch on the maximum contact principle shortly, but the importance of a child having, the input of both parents, parenting time with both parents. It's so important that, honestly, much as I appreciate the other, like some minor irritations, that's the way the courts. I appreciate how frustrating it could be, but the courts is going to treat it like that for the most part, because the child benefits more in the bigger picture from having that relationship and having that input from the other parent, as unwelcome as it might be to the other party sometime.
Yeah, so don't believe that, you're entitled to the day-to-day decisions in both households. That's not going to be the case. Yes. And again, these decisions need to be inconsistent with the best interest that we will talk about later. But and then you'll kind of get hopefully a better understanding of what that really entails.
Yeah, absolutely.
So parenting time.
Yeah.
Formerly known as access. And I think a lot of people thankfully, I think it's just now more easier to follow along. So if you did listen to our episode 1 where we talked about the changes, parenting time is it's simple. You understand that It's the time that you're actually spending with the child. And
I didn't like the idea of access. So when we talked about it, it's almost like I'm getting access to my child. There was just something with the custody and access terminology that never really worked for me, honestly. So I really like these changes.
It was just meant to be more inclusive. Yes. And then, it didn't polarize. The terminology was really outdated.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're glad we're finally in a place that represents us.
Yeah.
So parenting time, how do we deal with that?
In so many ways. There's so many ways. This is where, you could get really creative, right? And, oh God, that's just, you can have equal parenting time. What else? Some people...
You can have 4-3-3 schedules. You can
2-2-3, 5-4.
You can have alternating schedules, like 1 week, which is...
And people ask me, I don't know if you get this question, Sherine, but people would ask me, what do people usually do? And I'm like, I wish I could tell you. There is no usual.
It's so funny because for me to make that informed decision, I need to know what your schedules are, because I can tell you what, an XYZ schedule looks like, but if it's not going to be practical for both parties, then it doesn't make sense. Yeah. It has to be practical for you, practical for the children, where they're going to school, or pickups and drop-offs even, or I'm assuming pickups and drop-offs are pretty known with what they actually mean. So it's the time that you pick up or drop off the children with the schedule that you have.
Yeah, so I've had for practical reasons, sometimes that say one party is remaining in the matrimonial home and the matrimonial home is close to the children's school, then it might be practical for the other parent to say, well, I'll just have the children on the weekends. However, to just take all the weekends is sometimes not the fairest solution,
especially for both working families.
Yeah, and if the children are school age, that parenting time during the week is very limited, because for the most part they're in school. So you have, so we could say maybe every other weekend, right? And I know it's minimal time in some circumstances, but if you need to, if one party lives in, say, Toronto, and that's where the children are going to school, and maybe for employment reasons the other party is in Mississauga, well, maybe a midweek visit might not be appropriate for them. It might be. So if you ask me what's the regular, and I tell you it's equal parenting time every other week, is it best for your children for you to actually do that? And I think sort of this is where the best interest of the children really need to come in, like in everything that you do, right?
Yep, it prevails over everything.
Yes, so whether it's decision-making responsibilities, whether it's crafting your parenting schedules, you have to think in terms of what's in the best interest of the children. Yeah. And Sherine, when we're talking about the best interest of the child, like it's so important. Like you can refer to the act, either the Divorce Act or the Children's Law Reform Act, to list sort of the factors that a court would consider when thinking about the best interest of the child. So do you want to touch on some of those very quickly?
So the primary consideration in the best interest is really the child's physical, emotional, psychological safety, security, and well-being. But some of the factors that are related and actually are included in the best interest, and when looking at what's most appropriate, is the child's age, the stage of development, their need for stability, the nature and strength of the relationship between each parent, and if they're siblings, so half siblings also count, or half thank you, step siblings, grandparents, and the willingness of each party to support the other parent's relationship and development and maintenance with that child. And then the history of the care of the child's views and preferences. Usually this comes about when the child's usually at least 12 years old. Sometimes I've seen it at the age of 10. Mm-hmm. So it depends on the maturity. It depends on the child's maturity and the circumstances surrounding that that situation. The child's cultural, linguistic, religious, spiritual upbringing. So this is where, if one party is not religious and the other party is religious, this is where we want to make sure that both parties are getting the ability to parent in that circumstance. The willingness and the ability of each party to actually meet the care for the other party. So if, one party is at work the majority of the time, it doesn't really make sense for them to have an equal parenting schedule. And then any family violence that may impact the schedule. So that's a great consideration, and one that was actually even talked about more recently in the Divorce Act changes, that really we need to look at the family violence dynamic and any circumstances relating to the family violence dynamic and how that situation would apply with access. Parenting time. still new.
Old habits die hard, right? So you should write access. But yeah, so when you're looking at family violence, there is just this sort of increased recognition of how parenting can, if care and consideration isn't put into it, the violence can perpetrate, or the abuse can continue, because these parties are kind of tied because of the children that they have. So when making parenting orders, the courts really have to pay attention to sort of how serious was the family violence, how frequent is there a pattern of maybe coercive and controlling behaviors. What risk does this family violence have to the child, and things like that. So there's a number of considerations, but the family violence has been put front and center and has to be a consideration when thinking about the best interest of the child. It's always been, but I think now the courts just want to make sure that greater significance is
yeah, of course. So even when we're looking at, let's say there is a situation of family violence and maybe one party is more abusive to the other, and it may be verbal, it may be physical. Regardless, if it's an actual substantial violence, then maybe having joint decision making responsibility is not appropriate.
Exactly. So you're right.
Because it doesn't make sense for them to have those discussions, especially with that power imbalance. It's not.
So even in this example you use, Sherine, you don't even need physical abuse. If someone is controlling and coercive, and you have joint decision making, but you don't really have a voice.
Exactly. Because if they're going to ultimately be the one sensibly making that decision, and you just have to comply because out of fear or fear of safety for whatever reason, but ultimately for the fear of violence, that's not appropriate for you to have a joint decision making, because you're not actually making a joint decision.
And Sherine, you touched on something that I want to expand on a little bit. When I have clients that want to have joint decision making responsibilities, I really caution them with picking their battles. You cannot fight over every single thing. So people feel that if they can prove to the courts that the other side is just this bad person that's causing all of these irritations or annoyance or whatever is the aggravating factors that's bringing up the conflict, if they can show that the other party is the cause of the conflict, then the courts would still grant them decision making, because it's not their fault, it's the other party's fault, or even maybe in some way they might even get sole parenting. And honestly, that's very far from the truth. It doesn't necessarily work that way, especially when you want joint decision making, because in some cases the party would actually say, I think XYZ is a great mom or great dad. They just pick at everything, and I'm not trying to minimize the
importance of parenting
or the things that are maybe upsetting you. I agree, the other side is probably doing things wrong and they're irritating you. I get that. The fact that you're even in this separation process, I know you didn't come here lightly. The other party, both parties have done something, regardless of how you know, whoever you blame or whatever the one incident is that blew things up. It takes two. So you know what? I've already shared the responsibility between the both of you, but you want to be very careful, because from a court's perspective and looking at the best interest of a child, you can't have joint decision making responsibility if you guys have conflict all the time, and it doesn't matter. It just doesn't work for the child.
Yeah, and I think the reason why ultimately is because if you can't come to a decision, how do you get some finality there?
And again, don't try proving to me or to the court that it's the other party's fault. They may agree with you that it's the other party's fault, but if it's in the best interest of the child for the other party to have sole decision making responsibilities in this context, it doesn't matter. They will still get it. So think about it this way. You know, there's party A and party B, and party A is the one, you know, maybe causing conflict. That's what party B feels. If you keep picking up and arguing over everything and picking up over every conflict, and you guys are fighting all the time over everything, that's enough for party A to say, I don't think joint decision making responsibility would work. And party B would be very surprised that how is it possible? It's all party A's fault. Why is this happening to me? It's not happening to you. The courts understand that party A might be aggravating you, but what they're looking at is the best interest of the child. And if under the circumstances they think party A is, you know, the better person for them to give this sole decision making responsibility to avoid conflict, they will do that.
Yeah.
So I know that's usually a very hard pill to swallow, but I always say pick your battles. You know what? Just let it go. And it's difficult, but you know what? Ultimately, it's best for the child. We don't want children having to be exposed to. I don't know if saying exposed to conflict is the right way to put this, because the children may actually not be there and they may not be physically exposed to the conflict, but somehow it affects the quality of decision making if there's too much conflict.
Exactly. And the courts have even asked that it's actually a duty that parents have to shield the children as best as possible from family conflict, from conflict in general.
Yes.
So you definitely want to keep your mind open to that. And then I think in looking at kind of touching back on family violence, the one thing that you could look at is when you, let's say, for example, it's not appropriate during parenting time to do, pickups and drop-offs at the matrimonial home, for example, the former matrimonial home, then maybe it's appropriate to have supervised access exchanges. And there are facilities that offer that. So there would be a neutral third party that goes in and actually would facilitate just the exchange. Or you could do pickups and drop-offs just at a specific location, so school. So you want to limit the conflict as much as possible, especially in a circumstance where there is family violence.
Yeah.
So that's something that the court would order if it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. People, it's interesting how, you know, when pickups and drop-offs, it just seems so easy. You create and you know, sometimes people don't put their mind to it. But yeah, you're right. It could really be a cause of a lot of conflict. If you're not comfortable with your ex coming to your home, then maybe obviously just don't do that. I mean, we've created parenting schedules where pickup and drop-offs are at, you know, Tim Hortons, God bless them, McDonald's, the parking lot, right?
Worst case, the police station.
I'm not a fan of the police station,
but if it's, for example, if, you know, maybe, parties don't have access to actually pay for a supervised access exchange, then it may be appropriate to do something that's free, but it still makes you feel a little more comfortable. But in a family violence situation, we could limit, you know, contact altogether on exchanges. So maybe a neutral party just goes in and exchanges the children during that time. Yeah,
it could be a paid service, or it could be, you know, a trusted third party that's willing to do this for the party.
Yeah,
but you know, another thing with pickup and drop-offs is the driving. Oh my God, people really get caught up. And it seems like a minor detail, but when you think about how many years you might have to do the driving to pick up and drop off the children, it's worth putting your mind to when you're drafting your parenting schedule. So people would say, what's normal? Well, there's no normal, because if you think in terms of normal, so a simple example, say the parties lived in Toronto and now one party's moved up to Richmond Hill, and how do we do pickup and drop offs, right? One party might actually feel like, well, I shouldn't do all the driving. The other party should drive sometimes. And
yeah, they want what's fair. Sometimes it's either what's fair or most convenient.
Yeah, but really, is it
the
fair?
Reality is that's not how it works.
You moved to Richmond Hill. Is it fair? But now again, I pose that question not to put an answer in there, because I've been in that situation where it looked like it wasn't fair. The ex-partner moved out, moved several kilometers away from the matrimonial home, and my client had to do the driving. But when when a judge weighed in on the issue, it was, the judge said, well, for my client being the one staying at home at the time, and the ex having to start work very early, and then she having to pick the children back to a different city, it made more sense in that context to actually have my client do the pickup. Did that necessarily sound fair? No.
Oh, absolutely.
But it works for the children.
Exactly. The child will always prevail. So if you have, let's say downtown traffic in Toronto would be pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And you have maybe a midweek visit, it would be more appropriate if the other party can facilitate that exchange.
Yes.
Who lives, maybe not.
But if you're the party that has to do the driving to go drop you're going to be like, why don't we just scrap that visit then? But the court is going to say, no, we want to make sure that the child has as much parenting time with the other parent. So, if you have to do a little bit of driving, then that's what it has to be. So.
And that's in line with the maximum contact principle.
Yeah. So what is the maximum contact principle? Honestly, it's just a concept
it's really each party's obligation. So let's say it's really the parent's obligation to ensure the other parent has as much parenting time as possible with the other party, as maximum contact.
I don't know if I would say it's a parent's obligation to the other. You're raising the bar really high. I really like the way I interpret it is just that both parties have a right, or the children have the right, to enjoy maximum time with both parents, to the extent that it is in their best interest.
Exactly.
So we come back again to this best interest of the child. And the mistake we often make in the profession is a lot of people equate maximum contact with equal parenting. Couldn't be further from the truth, because the amount of time each child gets to spend with the parent has to be in their best interest. Maybe it would mean, in some situation, it would mean equal parenting time would be what's
if it's appropriate.
Yeah. Or in some cases, what might be appropriate might be one visit a month. I hope that's not the case, but but in some cases that may be appropriate. Again, tying back to family violence, maybe the children were exposed to it, and now there's resistance with spending time with that parent, and maybe the maximum time that's in the best interest of the child in that context is just one visit every month. So again, every family situation is different, but you have to think what's in the best interest of the child. There's studies after study after study that's shown that children benefit from having both parents' input on decision making, and having maximum time with both parents. It just helps the children's growth and development and all of that. And that's sort of what the entire family system, I guess, not just the courts, the mediators, the parenting professionals, that's sort of what we're trying to accomplish when we're trying to create a schedule. Now with the schedule, we've talked about sort of equal parenting time every other weekend, different days of the week about where the child spends 1 week here and another week there, because equal parenting could take different forms, right? It could be
like 2 days on, 2 days off, 4 days, like so many different ways to split a week.
And Sherine, you did say earlier, you when you want to draft a parenting schedule, you start off by trying to know the parents and the children's routines, and then it helps us kind of fit what works. There's no normal.
There's also no one size fits all. So we understand that, while this is a nice parenting schedule, for this year, it may not be appropriate the next year. Mm-hmm. So as the children grow older, their needs evolve, and so will the schedule. So it's important to not fixate on one very specific idea of how a schedule is going to look, because the children, with their schedules changing, there's nothing set in stone with respect to parenting.
Yeah.
That is a very, very common thing I think that a lot of people don't put their mind to, but it's never set in stone.
But even think within the year though, what are the number of times, like especially
even looking at the schedule now, there is no school, so where do you pick up, where do you drop off?
But even I know, like sometimes with, and I find this with teenage children, then sometimes they have, you know, time with their friends and they want to do this, like
and they
now
change the schedule.
So you want to maintain a flexible position, I think, is what I always say. You just want to be flexible with parenting, and if you know, don't necessarily, if a teenage child wants to go spend time with their friends, well, it might mean that you're being robbed of your time, but you know what, it's a phase. Maybe you just take them to that event, bring them back, and get whatever time you want. I don't know, depend. Well, again, you would have to do what works for your family. But what about holidays? So we have to look at holidays. Exactly. That's part of the schedule, right? You have to think of it.
Yeah, so like something I like to include. I mean, sometimes like there are people who have shift schedules, so they won't even be able to. Let's just say both parties are pretty amicable. We can just add like a very flexible, generous arrangement in there. But most of the time, we add a very specific holiday schedule. So Christmas, who's going to spend that time? Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's.
Well, there's other religious holidays. Eid, for example. Some people are particular about Eid. Other people don't care. There's Jewish holidays as well.
Even like your first communion, like people want to add very specific events in there as well. In addition to that, their summer schedule, March break, things like.
And all the public holidays that seem to come up almost every month. Yes, PA days. So you want to think about it. And it may just be, all we're trying to do is get you to think about things. So it may be that you want the PA day to follow the regular schedule, or maybe you want PA days to be treated differently, and maybe you alternate the PA days and not have it follow the regular schedule, right? If you're a parent, for example, that has the children less, maybe just weekends, every other weekend or something, then the PA days might be significant to you because it extends those weekends for you. Public holidays is a big one because, people have traditions around these holidays, right?
And Thanksgiving. You have time off work for the most part. So these are actually time that you have available, especially if maybe you do only alternate weekends and maybe a few midweeks.
But sometimes
but they're significant.
It's an area of conflict for people because
a lot.
People think the parent with less time would say, well, she has or he has all this time with the children, why can't I just have the long weekends? Well, the reason is a lot of times the children, when the parenting time is really not fun time, right? It's just routine. They go to school, they come back, you feed them. Like those long weekends, even the parent that's primarily with the children, they look forward to that long weekend. That's the time they get to also have fun time. Yeah. So I know the parent with less time would sometimes feel cheated and feel like it's the least the other parent can do. But just look at it sometimes from their perspective. It's also their time to have more fun time with the children.
Yeah, I mean, if you go in with the position that I should get every holiday and, all of that just because I don't have regular, or the other party has more of a parenting time, you're not going to be successful just because, it doesn't really make sense. And again, like the fun time versus actual, day-to-day time, they're very different. So you definitely want to put your mind to a holiday schedule, what that would look like. I think in moving with that,
so what if you have conflict? So there could be conflict with creating the plan, but even, I guess my biggest fear is even after we've created it, the day-to-day sort of management of the parenting
day-to-day
plan.
Or even joint major decisions. Sometimes you might have conflict there. You could have conflict in parenting time, the decision-making, really all of it. And that's usually where we add, if you have a court order or an agreement, we actually add in dispute resolution clauses, which say there's many different ways to go about it, but particularly we try doing parenting coordination. If that's unsuccessful, then you can do mediation if that's unsuccessful.
I usually like to just because with parenting coordinators, they're essentially arbitrators. So for me, personally, my style is if you're dealing with a parenting coordinator, then that's it.
A very parenting specific issue, it makes sense.
Yeah, then they just make, they listen to both of you, try to get you to settle, doesn't work, then you guys, should, just let them make the decision one way or the other, because I mean, that's why you guys have the parenting coordinators to help you. It's faster. It's a more summary process than trying to go back to the courts to deal with that issue. And as Sherine had mentioned, like alternate dispute resolution, it's now actually it's always kind of been, but again, it's reiterated now that you shall consider alternative dispute resolution options when it comes to parenting issues before resort to the court where possible. Yeah. Always, again, where possible. Sometimes it's not appropriate, but I challenge you, do really try. It is appropriate in a lot of cases.
With the word shall in there, it's an obligation that you have, and it's a new duty that's been afforded in the new amendment. So definitely want to consider. Of course, I mean, in the circumstance of cost and time, it makes sense to explore these options, again, if they're appropriate.
But even practical reasons, like how much judicial resources do you have available to sit with you and go over who gets what holiday? Like the judges don't have the time to do that.
Time pressing issue. Like it doesn't make sense
to where the court system is slow.
Exactly.
But I hate sort of the all or nothing. So you put your schedule, I put my schedule, and the court. And then, well, maybe if they even picked one, that might be fine. Sometimes they don't even pick either, and then they create something that absolutely doesn't work for your work, your children's school.
And trust me when I say that that's happened.
Yeah, and now you have to go back and try to change it. Both parties are especially unhappy, so obviously the judges know that you're better off negotiating that settlement when it comes to your children. You know your family better.
Yeah, the last thing the court wants to do is sit down and pick up and drop off times and, the nitty gritty. And the reality is there's not enough time during these court appearances to actually go through comprehensively what a schedule looks like.
So, and if you're in a trial situation, the judge's role for the most part is just to listen to both parties, just advocate, and then they go make a decision, right?
Exactly.
So, long story short, we're saying alternative dispute resolution options work best for you. We'll try to negotiate for you. That doesn't work. There's collaborative family law, mediation, and obviously there's arbitration, which a lot of the parenting coordinators would do for you. So let's say you're in a situation where for whatever reason you have limited parenting time because the other party is insisting that you don't have
the ability.
Yeah.
Or the capability of, caring, or, maybe not experienced enough. So.
And it's interesting and touching. It's very common. And I know it's a very interesting and touching subject because a lot of times, especially when you have new parents and again, this is not to pick on women, more power to us as moms, but a lot of times we feel like I don't know, something about that 9 months we carried the child, we just feel like we really know how to care for the child. But we feel like the dad just doesn't know how to care for the child properly.
Well, yeah, sometimes you could feel like they're not in tune with the child's needs and maybe doesn't really know what
but do you know how many times our male clients would say, well, we're both first-time parents. Exactly. You don't have any more experience than I do. So what I suggest, and I suggest this to both parties, is there's parenting courses and programs that are out there.
Of course. And the courts would even recommend it if there's, a dispute with respect to another parent's, ability to parent and, getting that kind of understanding as to basics sometimes. Mm-hmm. And there's even advanced programs. So
you know what some clients have actually told me? They actually learned something. Like it might be upsetting at first, but sometimes like they learn simple strategies and tools. I mean, parenting is a journey. As a parent myself, it is
an art and a skill.
Yeah, science and everything. There's no science to it. No, there's not. It's just a journey, and you do the best that you can, and you try to improve yourself as a parent the best that you can, right? So we just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that there's parenting courses and programs that are available. You can take them proactively, whether or not whether your parenting abilities are being challenged. But if it is, then that's probably a good way to just end the conversation and just get that extra training, as unfair as it may be. And as we said, sometimes we actually ask both sides to take them just so that nobody feels picked on. So Sherine, is there anything else you wanted to touch on this topic? I think I'm good.
I think we've covered a lot, and hopefully you take something away from here, and maybe even when you're having that discussion about parenting, you can put your mind to what that looks like, and now having understanding of what decision making responsibilities look like, what day-to-day decisions look like. what a schedule, including a holiday schedule looks like. So a lot of different areas that go into parenting.
Yeah, so maybe let's leave you with this test. So when you're thinking about parenting, remember, what's the difference between major decision-making responsibilities and day-to-day decisions? Who gets to make major decisions and who gets to make day-to-day decisions? Here's a tip. Day-to-day decisions are made by the party who has the children in their care at the time. You also want to think of what schedule works for your family on a day-to-day, and there's different options, and what holidays matter to you, and how do you want to share it. You may decide to share all holidays, or you may just pick the few that mean something to you and then let the rest, the other party have the rest, whatever, right? Because I do know for some families, for example, they have their Christmas dinners on
a different day.
Yeah, on Christmas Eve. For some people, it's the tradition on Christmas Eve, while maybe dad's family is on Christmas Day. So, hey, that solves the problem right there, right? So things like that. And just think about, how, if there's a dispute in the future, because there will be, even parties that are still together, parenting do have conflicts on decisions affecting their children. Put your mind to how do you want to resolve these disputes when they do come up, and alternative dispute resolution options are your go-to. And if you're able to engage a parenting coordinator to just have their working with you along the way, that's fantastic. And I think that kind of summarizes everything we've talked about. So all the best as you make your parenting decisions. If you need our help, you know where to find us, on the phone, 905-492-7662. info@y-canada.com is our email address, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.
Thanks for listening and joining us in the AP Legal Zone. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find more episodes by searching AP Legal Zone on anywhere you watch podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast today so you can stay connected with any updates and get notified about any new episodes.